If you've been on the standard American diet for really any number of years, then you're probably a little out of touch with your natural satiety mechanisms, which signal feelings of fullness. So I recently received an excellent question from Sandy, and she would like to know more information about a daily portion guide that can be recommended for volume eaters. So in this video, I'm going to compare 4 different nutrition guides from various dietitians and plant-based doctors, all of which seem to hold the most credence when it comes to answering this question. But make sure you stick around for the end of the video because I'm going to summarize all of my recommendations that I have gathered from these individual food guides. So when I talk about volume eaters, I am just referring to people who really need that full amount of bulk in their stomach in order to feel those feelings of satiety and can feel comfortable ending the meal at that point. I personally have always viewed myself as a volume eater. I eat a ridiculous amount of raw fruits and vegetables every day because I yearn for that feeling of fullness. And I feel like I only get it when I'm eating enough of those raw fruits and veggies because those are what hold the fiber and the water, and it provides that bulk in my stomach that I'm looking for. Whenever I eat a lesser volume of food but higher in calories, I still do not get that feeling of satiety. Whether it's a learned behavior or something in our genetics, some people I feel are just prone to needing more food. And that might not necessarily mean more calories, it just means more quantity. So first I want to take a look at Brenda Davis's vegan plate. So she is an amazing dietitian and she has been in the vegan and plant-based realm for quite a number of years. So I really like to reference her plate for the average whole food plant-based advocate that's not necessarily focused on weight loss. What I'm going to show you at the end of this video is my recommendations specifically for volume eaters and weight loss. Okay, so what I love about Brenda's plate is that it includes all of her recommendations for the different supplements that she would typically suggest for a vegan diet. So this would entail omega-3s. Vitamin B12 is another one that's consistently recommended. This one's non-negotiable, so I would definitely follow along with that. And then we have vitamin D and iodine. However, what I do not like about this plate is that it does include some more processed items. So things like tortillas and soy milk and tofu, which, are not in and of themselves unhealthful as long as they're made from whole foods, right? But again, the pastas, the breads, these items are just going to be a little higher in calorie density and more readily absorbed into your system and potentially stored as fat. So we want to stay away from those lightly processed items as much as possible if you are particularly interested in weight loss. And for volume eaters, I would say all of us are looking for the diet with the highest amount of nutrient density, but the lowest amount of calories per pound of food. Brenda's plate also recommends daily nuts and seeds. Now, this is something that I just don't agree with because in our natural history, it just doesn't make sense to me that we would always have nuts and seeds at our disposal, especially ground up seeds. Like that was really, really unlikely for us to get on a daily basis. So once in a while, these foods are perfectly fine. So this plate also does not include any serving recommendation sizes. So that can be a little complicated. And honestly, what I've learned through this process is that there really is no one set recommendation for all individuals. So we'll get into the summary and the consensus at the end of this video. But the 2 things I love about this plate are that the vegetables are the most highly emphasized next to fruit and legumes. I would definitely agree with that. Okay, let's move on and look at Dr. Kristi Funk's Whole Food Plant-Based Eating Guide. This was one of my favorites because of her ginormous emphasis on the quantity of vegetables we should be taking in on a given day. This is what I feel a healthful whole food plant-based meal should look like, referencing the different serving sizes of the vegetables, whole grains, healthy protein, and fruits. Now, I'm not a big fan of referring to foods in their macronutrient constituents, so like healthy protein and healthy fat. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, nor the public, I feel. It makes a lot more sense just to talk about foods in their, general form. But something I found confusing about this particular plate is that she includes animal products and processed foods. So for a whole food plant-based diet plan, that is really conflicting. But I also appreciated her emphasis on fluids. Not enough of the food guides focus on hydration. That is a huge macronutrient that needs to be included in the equation. But something that threw me off a little bit was the fact that she included coffee on this list. Now, coffee is actually a diuretic, so it will create dehydration instead of reducing it. So that was my only kind of take back from this. All right, so let's move on to Dr. Sunil Pai's plate. He does a great job of providing all of the different serving recommendations, as well as his inclusion of herbs and spices like turmeric, black pepper, ginger, fennel, cumin. These are so underplayed when it comes to the plant-based food categories. Herbs and spices should always be included in your meals, and as much as possible, and is in many different variations as you can muster. Okay, but something that threw me off a little bit about this plate is that he includes both 1 to 3 tablespoons of seeds as well as 1 ounce of nuts per day. Usually it's either or, but Dr. Pai was very adamant about including these separately. Now again, back to my original viewpoint that nuts and seeds don't seem to be something that we should include in our diet all the time. If you choose to, that's perfectly fine, but I don't think it should be a requirement, especially for those who already have excess fat on their body, because if you have stored fat, you don't need exogenous fats from your food. You can just metabolize the fats that are already stored in your body, and you'll get all of the essential omega-3s and omega-6s that you require. I also appreciated Dr. Pai's inclusion of recommending both raw and cooked vegetables. That is so important, and I absolutely want to emphasize that on my recommendations. On the food guide, I'll show you at the end of this video. All right, so let's move on to Julieanna's plate. Now, Julieanna Hever is a fantastic dietitian. Her and Brenda are just like the most knowledgeable, informative individuals when it comes to dietitians in this realm that I've come across so far. So there's so many wonderful things to say about Julieanna's version of a food guide, because it not only has the serving sizes, but it has the portion sizes. It has a separate category for mushrooms and leafy greens and cruciferous veggies. But another thing I really like about this is that she puts high-fat whole foods into a category and explains how they should be used sparingly. To me, that makes a lot more sense than putting a daily recommendation for things like nuts and seeds and avocados and such, for the reasons I spoke about earlier. And I know that I mentioned that referring to foods in their macronutrient constituents is not really helpful to the public. I feel like this is an exception when we are trying to include all of those whole food, high fat items. It's so much easier to put them in this type of category than saying nuts and seeds and other fatty whole food plant-based items like the avocados and the olives and the coconuts and such. But there was a huge red flag for me when I saw that she recommends 6 to 11 servings of whole grains per day. Now, 1 serving is considered like 1 piece of bread. Could you imagine eating an entire loaf of bread every day? This is too much for me. And the second thing I notice is that she makes it a point not to distinguish between starchy and non-starchy vegetables. I feel that these really do require their own categories because they are so different in calorie density, and that's so much more helpful for people who are trying to lose or maintain their weight if they can distinguish between, oh, this one I can have this much of, and this one I can have this much of, and it won't change the number on the scale too much. All right, so let's discuss the major common themes that I saw throughout my research looking at all of these different plant-based food guides. So something I noticed across the board was the fact that they focus on 100% whole grains as opposed to just whole grains in and of itself. Because what marketing companies love to do is trick us into thinking that something is healthier than it actually is. So what they do is they put whole grain on their item, but that does not entail that it is 100% whole grain, which is the exact reference you want to look for when buying some kind of processed whole grain item. So for any kind of bread, you want to make sure that the first ingredient is 100% whole grain. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of processed junk, and you're missing out on all the fiber and phytonutrients and many different vitamins and minerals that could have otherwise been in that food, but it was removed during processing in order to usually extend the shelf life or change the mouthfeel of the item or even to change the flavor. But I want to point out that the majority of these plates and food guides that I researched recommend a high serving count of these whole grains. Now, for weight loss, what I have found time and time again is that anything more than 3 servings of whole grains per day is going to be detrimental to your weight loss efforts. So 1 serving is considered a half of a cup of cooked grains. So don't measure your oatmeal when it's dry and consider that as your serving. Make sure you measure it after it's already been cooked and it's soaked up all that water. That would be a half of a cup or a full serving of oatmeal. So 3 of those per day would be your maximum allotted calorie amount for those whole grains in a day if you're trying to lose weight or maintain your weight loss. But this is a minimum. This is not a maximum. So if you fluctuate this from day to day, it's not a big deal. You don't have to get 3 servings of whole grains. It's just the upper recommended limit. The second theme I consistently saw was the recommendation for 2 to 3 servings of legumes per day. Now, 1 serving of legumes is just like whole grains. It's about a half of a cup cooked beans. So after you've already let them soak up all that water, then the half of a cup of cooked beans is the serving size. So 3 of those, a cup and a half per day, is the maximum recommendation. And at least a half of a cup is the minimum recommendation. Legumes are so important for health promotion and weight loss and all of those wonderful benefits that we should be getting from our nutritious foods. There was also a huge emphasis on vegetables being the major category from which we should gain the majority of the volume of our food, especially those leafy greens and cruciferous veggies. Another common theme is that the second major category for which we should place the majority of our volume should be fruit. Fruit has so many wonderful health benefits, just like vegetables. Growing up, everybody knows you eat your fruits and veggies, you grow up big, strong, and smart. That's what I tell my daughter all the time, trying to instill this into her mind from a very young age. But it's the one thing that all of the conflicting dietary views do not argue on, right? It's the one thing that we all agree upon. Fruits and veggies, first and foremost. Another theme is that these high-fat, whole food, plant-based items are really, really minimized and should be used sparingly across the board, with that exception of the having a serving of nuts and seeds per day. That was also a very common theme, except in Julieanna's version of her plant-based plate. And the last common theme was that they all minimized or completely eliminated processed foods and animal products. That should be a given. When I refer to a whole food plant-based diet, that's exactly what I am referring to. No other variation of, yeah, I'm sort of plant-based, but I also eat meat on Mondays or something. That's not what I'm talking about. When I say whole food plant-based, it means foods as grown, whole plant foods as grown. So ideally, we would try to reduce or eliminate the animal products and the processed foods as much as possible to promote health and longevity, but also, of course, weight loss and weight maintenance. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about my recommendations that I have gathered throughout the years of researching this time and time again and staying up to date as possible with the evidence, but also noticing practically in my own life and in my practice with my weight loss clients, how the heck does this really play out in real life? Because there are so many factors that go into how much we should eat on a given day. So my recommendations specifically pertain to those who are trying to lose weight or maintain their weight loss, with an emphasis on volume eaters. So I just want you to keep in mind that these recommendations and these serving sizes and portions, these will fluctuate and vary from day to day and from person to person. This is all dependent on our genetics and our fitness level, our body composition, our activity level that day, our age. Like, there's so much that goes into our metabolism that we don't appreciate. It's not just calories in, calories out. Yes, you do need to be in a calorie deficit in order to lose weight, but that's not the end of the story. There are so many pieces to this puzzle that we don't even comprehend at this point in time because we haven't been studying it long enough. Okay, so taking a look at my food guide, the first thing you'll notice is that the non-starchy veggies are the most emphasized portion of volume on the daily recommendations. So for these, you want to eat as much as possible, shoot for 6 to 9 servings per day with an emphasis on those leafy greens and cruciferous veggies. Vary these in color and eat some raw and cooked each day. And then we have a serving size being 1 cup raw or a half cup cooked. I did differentiate the non-starchy from the starchy veggies in order to have that distinction between those high-calorie starchy options and those low-calorie non-starchy options, because non-starchy veggies should be eaten ad libitum to a point where you're not consciously counting calories. You're just enjoying your experience of eating that food. Now, when it comes to those starchy veggies, the potatoes, the beans, the split peas, the sweet potatoes, the squash, The winter squash, not the summer squash. These are the things you need to be more cognizant about when you are ingesting them instead of just passively kind of munching on some broccoli or something. You need to pay attention to how much squash and how much sweet potatoes you are consuming if you want to maintain your weight loss or lose weight. So I put legumes and starchy veggies in the same category because legumes are highly starchy in those resistant starches and those slow burning starches. So lots of complex carbohydrates are in this category. These should really be the bulk of your carbohydrate source, are the legume family. So for serving sizes, I recommended 1 to 3 servings of legumes per day and or 2 to 4 servings of other starches. So 1 serving is about a cup of cooked non-legume starches and a half a cup of cooked legume starches. So I know we're really getting in the weeds here, but again, don't focus on the details. Focus on the bulk of what you get over the week, not so much day to day. As long as you're hitting these on the head the majority of your week, you're perfectly fine. You don't have to get too neurotic about this because then it just creates stress and you gain more weight. So let's not defeat the purpose. Essentially, if you're eating whole, unprocessed plant foods, you really shouldn't need to be worrying much about this in the first place. It's when you start dabbling into those animal products or those slightly processed modifications that you really start to see your weight go up and the health problems initiate. So following the non-starchy veggies, you'll notice that the fruit is actually the second largest volume of recommended daily intake. So this is an emphasis on berries first and foremost, but also different color variations. Other options include citrus, apples, pears, plums, etc. So this would be 4 or more servings per day. 1 serving equals 1 medium size or a half cup of raw, frozen, or cooked fruit. Preferably, you would eat your fruit raw or frozen so you don't damage the integrity of the cell walls. And then following the legumes and starchy veggies for volume, lastly would be the 100% whole grain category. So this would include things like oats, quinoa, amaranth, teff, sorghum, black rice, etc. So the wheat, rye, and barley, I actually excluded for those with gluten intolerances like myself or other autoimmune conditions. This protein tends to create so much havoc in people's bodies when it comes to autoimmune reactions that it's just better to eliminate it. And then after it's out of your diet for 3 to 6 months, slowly start to bring it back in and see if any of your antibody levels increase or if you see any, external symptoms, then it's a big red flag. But also this is helpful to help people lose weight because this does induce inflammation. There is so much glyphosate on these crops when it comes to the wheat particularly that you just are better off leaving it alone. There are so many other whole food plant-based options to choose from. And lastly, I wanted to include other daily or weekly inclusions. So this entails at least 3 different types of mushrooms per week. I loved that recommendation from Julieanna. Mushrooms are so beneficial for, again, not just our health, but for weight loss and weight maintenance. I also like the inclusion of using a variety of herbs and spices in all meals, as well as drinking plenty of 0-calorie fluids with an emphasis on water, of course. I also recommend using nuts, seeds, and other high-fat foods sparingly, just as Julieanna had in her presentation. This seems to resonate the most, both with myself and with my clients. And lastly, try to eliminate all highly refined foods and animal products. There is so much more information I could put on this chart, but I feel like this really narrows it down to the nitty-gritty. Like, this is the bare minimum of what you would need to know on a given basis if you're trying to follow a whole food plant-based diet for health and weight loss or weight maintenance as a volume eater. So what these recommendations allow you to do is fill up on things like leafy greens and cruciferous veggies, and then fruit, and then legumes and starchy veggies, and finally a little bit of whole grains or some high-fat foods if you are interested in those things. So please leave me some feedback, you guys. Sandy, especially you, if this was helpful or if you still have questions, let me know. And if anybody else has any questions they would like me to cover and research in my videos, please let me know. This is by far my favorite thing to do, is research plant-based nutrition. I also work with people one-on-one if you're interested in gaining some support and some accountability when it comes to your weight loss journey. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.